Hi, everyone. Hi to you.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Greene, thank you so much for being here for
Oh,
this
my pleasure.
special live version of Beyond Belief. This is actually kind of a dream of mine. As I told Dr. Greene earlier tonight when he autographed my book, I have been following his career for more than almost 25 years. Have loved everything that you've written, and I've learned a tremendous amount from you already. So to have the opportunity to speak directly about pretty, intense matters, the deepest questions of reality is really an amazing treat. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
So I feel like we're going to sing a duet first, but just
No.
to start off, let's start where I'm sure that we agree. You've written about the reverence you have for the physical world, for outer space, for planets and stars, and I think that that's something that a lot of people share. I mean, religious people definitely have it, and one of the things that I've had the privilege of speaking to several physicists about a lot of different matters, and the one thing that we really, really connect on is we are living in an incredible, beautiful, and elegant reality. Could you reflect for a moment how that inspired you to get involved in physics, and what does it mean to you that the world is beautiful?
Well, I think all of us, as you mentioned, have had that experience of being out on a dark night and just being overwhelmed by the immensity of space, the grandeur of the stars, and the sheer wonder of floating in this immensity that is filled with things that are just emotionally overwhelming if you open yourself up to it. As a physicist, just to bring it to a more particular perspective, when I have that experience, I'm also having the experience of seeing a little bit behind the scenes, seeing the mathematics that we've developed that we think is a pretty good approximation to what allows the stars to exist, what allows space to expand. And when you put all that together, it's deeply gratifying to recognize the incredible order, the incredible coherence that all of what we see can be summarized in a handful of mathematical equations that we humans have somehow had the capacity to develop and write down. So somewhere in there is the origin of that particular feeling for me.
Which I understand, and...
But you did ask for the inspiration.
Yes.
And perhaps I would be incomplete in my answer if I weren't to say that a big part of my inspiration came from the Friday night blintzes of this woman right over there, Anna Freiberg, who, without that, I don't think we would be having this conversation at all. I just needed to get that out there. Okay.
So, okay, we agree on that. Let's drill down a little bit into a layperson's understanding of physics and the physical world. And I'll tell you up front, I can't do the equations. I have read a lot of books on this topic as a layperson, enjoyed them tremendously, and had the privilege of, as I said, of interviewing some significant people. So let me map it out like this, with your permission. So there's, one quote. I need my glasses for this. I'm sorry. Okay. There was an essay entitled "Particles Do Not Exist" by physicist Paul Davies. And it says that we find that the particle concept is nebulous, and ideally it should be abandoned completely. John Gribben agrees and writes that what we call particles, for want of a better name, what they are, we do not know. The particle concept is simply a crutch ordinary mortals can use to help them towards an understanding of mathematical laws. Okay, so what I learned from that is the fundamental underpinning of everything that I know, all the physical reality that I touch and feel, is somehow much more elusive than I imagined, which I find to be odd to begin with. Of course, I grew up thinking they taught us that there's these little balls that spin around in space, and apparently that's not correct. But what I find is that when you drill down into physical matter, the less of it actually seems to be there. And then when I couple it, I brought a couple of books with me. I know this is Carlo Rovelli. There's a book called The Order of Time, which is fantastic, by the way, if you want to read it, in which I learned from him that time doesn't exactly exist. And then I read this book called The One, by Dr. Pius, it's how you pronounce it, a German particle physicist, and he makes the assertion that the entire universe is a oneness, is one thing. And so again, as a layman, I look at all that, and here's what I put together. When you look at physical reality, it's not really there. When you look at time, it's not really there. And you put the whole thing together and you have one. And all I can think is like, my gosh, does that sound like something I know? What do you make of that and my experience of it as a non-professional?
I'd say a couple things. First, there's an integrity to your experience because it's real for you, and if it gives you insight and helps you find an understanding of things, all the better. So I'm not here to pass judgment on the particular things that you find useful to overlay the world, but what I will say is we human beings have brains that evolved under the pressures of survival in the African savanna. And the things that we were led to be able to understand were the things that helped us get a leg up in the competition for survival. Mm-hmm. And among the things that we needed to survive, you will not find listed an understanding of a particle, or an understanding of the deep nature of time, or an understanding of quantum mechanics or general relativity. In fact, those of our forebears in that environment who sat down for a moment and took a break from hunting the next meal to think about quantum mechanics or electrons are the very members of our species who got eaten because they weren't paying attention to things that really mattered back then. Which is just to say that we shouldn't be surprised that concepts that human beings come up with to try to describe the external world are incomplete or fuzzy or approximate or, in some cases, even misleading. Mm-hmm. So, to me, the wonder is quite the reverse of the failure to fully articulate the nature of reality. The reverse is how far we've been able to get with this reptilian brain that was not developed to make predictions that what particles would slam into each other at the Large Hadron Collider and what would come out of those collisions. And yet, we can sit down with the equations of quantum mechanics, which within does have a notion of particles, does have a notion of fields. Right. We do these calculations, and we then look at the predictions. We build a big machine, and we test those predictions. And for instance, there's a magnetic property of electrons called the magnetic dipole moment. It doesn't matter exactly what it is, but I raise it only because we've been able to calculate that number decimal by decimal to more than 10 places after the decimal point. That's mathematics that we humans, I believe, invent, come up with the concepts, do the calculation. We then measure reality, the thing that's out there, whatever it is. We measure the magnetic properties of whatever this thing called an electron fundamentally is. I like to think of it as a particle, but that's clearly just an approximation, I agree. But decimal place by decimal place to 10 decimal places, it agrees with the mathematical calculation. Mm-hmm. That's incredible. Yes. That we've been able to do that. And so, yes, our concepts are approximate. They can be useful. They're not the fundamental truth, I don't think, yet, or perhaps ever, but how far we've gotten is breathtaking.
100%. And I don't, if I implied that it...
No, I wasn't being defensive about that. Just being impassioned about it.
Okay. Yes, so without question, what what science has accomplished, especially in physics, the predictions, the effectiveness of it, the technology that's come from it is extraordinary. What seems wondrous to me as somebody who's coming with a spiritual bent towards this whole thing is how reminiscent of spiritual ideas some of the physics seems to be.
Yeah. And so I should say at the outset that I'm completely open to that idea. I'm completely open to, at some point, maybe it's already in existence or in the future, finding some deep revelation that I think is unlikely, but I'm open to the possibility that we will find that in the end, the answers have always been there and they're in Scripture properly interpreted. I allow that as a real possibility. And I don't mean that as a pejorative or, some kind of diss. I really, in fact, I have to tell you, if that were to happen, I'd be far happier and more excited than I've ever been in my entire life.
Yes.
If we were able to actually establish wow, I mean, that would be spectacular. I think it's unlikely, but just that's where I'm coming from. But I also think it's quite likely that we human beings who are, in the end, pattern recognition devices, we're pattern recognition gadgets that look out into the world and try to find some order, some coherence, some explanation. Naturally, it's conceivable and to me likely that if you're coming from a spiritual orientation, you will pick and choose those aspects of the scientific worldview that resonate and aligned with your perspective. I mean, let me not even talk specifically about yours, but for instance, my brother comes from a different spiritual discipline, Hare Krishna. Mm-hmm. And he has spent an enormous amount of energy over the course of his life immersed in the Vedic texts. Mm-hmm. And all through my graduate career and my early research career, as I would sort of excitedly tell him about this or that discovery or understanding in general relativity or cosmology, he would often say, we already knew that. Vedic text 9, Vedic text 13, and I found it slightly deflating, but also potentially interesting.
Yes.
And when I pushed a little bit further, and perhaps he will disagree with that, so perhaps I shouldn't be talking without having the opportunity to respond in real time, but whenever I looked in detail, there was a resonance of language and description. We would talk about vibrations, and there'd be a notion of vibrations in the spiritual text. Mm-hmm. We would talk about, uncertainty, and there would be a notion of uncertainty in the spiritual text. So there was a resonance of ideas, mm-hmm. but it's a very superficial and general resonance. So at times I did ask, and perhaps it was out of turn, but I would ask, show me Schrodinger's equation in the Vedic text. Show me Einstein's field equations of the general theory of relativity in the Vedic, and that I've never seen done. So can there be a resonance of ideas at a superficial level?
Sure.
For sure. Does it suggest that they are the same? Not necessarily.
I totally hear that, and I also have some general interest in the Vedic text, and I think there's a lot there. Of course, being Jews with a particular interest, and I think you would feel that we were coming at it maybe in a similar way, but I would just throw out, for whatever it's worth, since it would make you very happy if it was such a thing, we also feel that we have a pretty good case to make, and that there are some very surprising aspects and some a little bit more than just resonance, especially with string theory, which I don't know if it is ultimately real. I know there's mathematical formulae that seem to support it, and I'm fascinated by it. But when I consider that the Kabbalah, for instance, talks about a 10 or 11 dimensional universe, and know that string theory seems to suggest something similar, or that we also have a concept of a 26 dimensional universe. It's not a knockout blow, it's not mathematical proof, but I will tell you, for whatever it's worth, that there is a lot of fascinating coincidences.
Yeah.
And they may exist across culture. I haven't had the opportunity to do the research, but and maybe that's part of the thing that can twist the dialogue in a particular direction, and maybe it's worth talking about at some point, in the future, if it's very compelling or doesn't hold water. And by the way, if it didn't hold water, I wouldn't be particularly interested in it. So, but like Saj said, we're having a Chavrusaschaft, and I figured I would throw that out because I find some of it extremely compelling. But that's not the main thing that I want to tell you or ask you about. Did you want to say something?
No, again, I was going to say that, there's all sorts of interesting numerology that I've encountered.
Yeah.
And it has always felt to me a little bit, and again, not in a pejorative sense, but it almost feels like confirmation bias.
Yeah.
You're looking for a place of contact, and you focus in on the points that seem to coalesce, but you throw away all the ones.
Yes, some of it is like that, honestly, but some of it is not.
Right.
And the part that is not, and I would love to bounce it off you at some point, just because I know you would approach it from a scientific perspective, and I would be totally happy to hear that it was bogus. I don't feel that it is, but it would be fascinating to know.
Sure.
Maybe that's for a part 2 sometime.
But the other thing I would also say is, it's not like we scientists hold the ultimate standard of truth that human beings should strive for. And so part of me does wonder why it matters to you that there's resonance potentially between these different perspectives, because it's not like we're the gold standard on every issue of importance to human beings. We're pretty good when it comes to understanding the fundamental ingredients and the fundamental laws.
Yes.
But we're not all that good at understanding how those ingredients and those laws come together to yield interesting macroscopic structures that we care about and that we love and that makes life worth living. Maybe one day we'll be able to fully describe a human being at the level of their fundamental ingredients and how they come together, but certainly we can't do it now. And I don't know that it'll ever be insightful. I don't think we're ever really going to talk about, any major. I don't think we'll ever understand World War II at the level of the particles governed by Schrodinger's equation. It just won't be insightful. At the level of human relationships and human antagonisms and the need for, tribal association, those sorts of issues, I think, are going to give us far more insight into things that matter at a human scale. And so some of me wonders why you even have the urge to connect with something that operates in a different domain.
The reason is because so much of culture is in what I would call the thrall of scientific thinking, that it's not possible to communicate value from a spiritual perspective, often, if there's no scientific basis associated with it.
Yeah, no, I can hear that.
And so a lot of people, first of all, outside of finding it fascinating, a lot of people try to ground their spiritual thinking in scientific thinking. It's a very old idea, by the way. Like Maimonides held very strongly that there was no contradiction between what he's Torah and science as he understood it in his day.
Sure.
And I think that's ultimately the reason, is like the strength of the scientific worldview is so dominant that unless you deal with it, you're not taken seriously.
Yeah. But I guess the flip side is, if one takes a literal interpretation of certain scriptural texts, it's very difficult to align a literal interpretation with reality as science has explicated it.
Yes.
If you take a
sometimes.
metaphorical and interpretive
Yeah.
exegesis of those ideas,
Yes.
then we human beings are pretty good at mapping a whole variety of ideas expressed in one language,
Yeah.
say, in scripture, to other things in the world. And I find that a fascinating capacity of the human brain to link up things that perhaps were developed for one purpose and align them with things in another. I mean, there's a wonderful capacity of the human brain to do that. But to me, it speaks more about the human brain than it does about the veracity of, say, the scripture.
It definitely has something to do with the human brain and our interpretive abilities,
Yeah.
which are applied across the board. And I don't know if you agree with me on this or not, but in my experience of considering science, which used to be called natural philosophy,
Yeah.
right? So science is in the business of producing data, doing experimentation, making hypotheses, and it produces a body of information. And then it seems to me that the interpretation begins. And as a layperson, again, I've noticed that you can have experts in this field on this side and on this side. They're using the exact same data and the same studies, and they're coming to wildly different conclusions. And I've actually gone to scientists in the past and asked, like, how am I supposed to deal with this? I'm thinking of paleontology specifically.
Yeah.
Same studies, same concepts, and this guy says it means this, and this guy says it means this, and they're both credible. And so one person I went to at actually a brain guy at Harvard, and he said, well, the reason is because you're dealing with psychological realities. You have one scientist who wants the data to mean this, and one scientist who wants the data to mean this, and therefore they're philosophically talking about it. It's no longer a scientific matter. How does that strike you?
Well, I think there are episodes of that sort for sure, but there are also disagreements and debates in science which are not driven by what we want to be true, but rather our educated scientific judgment regarding what the data is trying to tell us. In the early days of quantum mechanics, it's a really good example because we were entering a domain of physics that no one had ever experienced in any direct way before, the realm of molecules and atoms and subatomic particles. And in that realm, we found that the ordinary physics that Newton gave us, that allowed us to understand the trajectory of a macroscopic object very simply and very intuitively, all of those ideas failed in this microscopic realm. So new paradigms, new concepts, new mathematical ideas needed to be developed and introduced and aligned with the data. And there were different ways that people pursued it, and there were rich scientific arguments. But ultimately, by 1927, those arguments largely came to a close. Not completely, but largely came to a close. And the scientists came together behind what we now call quantum mechanics. That's healthy science. And I wouldn't say that any of those arguments were really driven by a psychological desire for the universe to be one way or another. It was really people following different mathematical trajectories. In particular, Heisenberg had his way, using a mathematical gadget called a matrix. Schrödinger had his way, together with other collaborators, using a gadget called differential equations and wave motion. It turned out that they both were correct, even though they were framing the ideas in radically different approaches. So it was a beautiful example of a debate, but in this particular case, it wasn't someone who was right, someone who was wrong. They were just following different mathematical languages to get to the same destination.
That's the Copenhagen school versus the...
No, not even. It's matrix mechanics that you never hear about any longer because Heisenberg's approach was a little ungainly mathematically. But he actually got to a version of what's now called Schrödinger's equation before Schrödinger. But he didn't express it in a form that was particularly easy for the mathematicians and physicists of the time to fully grasp.
Interesting. Can I ask you about the constants of nature for a moment?
Please, yeah.
Okay. So for the audience, if you don't know what this concept means, there are certain parameters in which the physical universe is set up by. the rate of gravitation, how strong or weak a nuclear force is. There's a series of parameters of how physical matter is governed. And there's some fascinating things associated with them. So one thing that I learned about was that stars produce energy by fusing two hydrogen atoms into a single helium atom. And during that reaction, 0.007% of the mass of the hydrogen atom is converted into energy. So now, if the percentage was 0.006, the universe would be filled only with hydrogen, and if it was 0.008, the universe would have no hydrogen and therefore no water and no stars like the sun. So commenting on this, theoretical physicist Richard Feynman said the following. He said, "It's one of the greatest damn mysteries of physics, a magic number that comes to us with no understanding by man. You might say the hand of God wrote that number and we don't know how he pushed his pencil." Does it bother you? Like, does it give you a moment of pause that this strange setup for life seems to exist in our universe, where so many things have to align, and each thing is so unlikely? Where do you go when you hear that kind of information?
It could have been the hand of God. And again, as I said, if that truly is the answer, wow, right? That will be a wonderful insight to the nature of reality. But without any evidence for that directly, we're driven to try to find other explanations, more pedestrian explanations. And you're right, we've not come up with an answer to that fully yet, but there's some very interesting ideas on the table. And I find them particularly interesting, not because I think that they're necessarily right, but because they don't need God's hand to push anything. And that at least suggests an interesting alternative to the, I think, fairly jocular description that Richard Feynman gave it. But it's possible that there are many universes. We don't know this, but let's just follow where this idea leads. And it's possible that these other universes have values for those numbers that you mentioned that differ from our universe. And so in those other universes, you're right. The hydrogen, they never fuse together to create helium, and you don't have stars in those universes. And because you don't have stars, you probably don't have planets, you probably don't have life in those universes. But if there are enough universes, and those numbers are sprinkled randomly across all of those universes, something that is compatible with certain mathematical theories that we have, so this is not just a wild imaginative scheme. If you imagine all these different universes with these numbers sprinkled randomly, then there are going to be some in which the numbers happen to have the right value for the processes that yield stars to actually take place. We necessarily would live in one of those universes because we couldn't live in any of the other universes.